typically when we talk to an academic conference, we are reporting on a particular piece of research, but I'm not going to do that today. I have been studying school reform in the United States and in other countries since 1970. I should be retired by now, but I don't have to, so I'm not. And I'm offering some observations that cover a variety of studies that I've conducted over that whole time period. I will, however, just to remind you that even though I'm very old, I can still do something of research. I will report on some findings on a paper that I'm currently working on toward the end. I want to say, most of you, I would like to say, you come from a very beautiful country, but so do I. We're just a lot flatter, and we have more water. Even though I'm sure that in the newspaper these days what you read about is Ted Cruz, I come from Minnesota, which is practically in Canada, and we are actually culturally more similar to Canada. In fact, I refer to the Minnesota as the lost province of Canada. And part because we were settled primarily by Northern Europeans, Germans, Swedes, and Norwegians, and not very many people wanted to move there. It's very cold for a long time. Now it's very different, but the traditions and the culture of Northern Europe are predominant there. So we're quieter than Ted Cruz. We're more formal than Ted Cruz. We don't like conflict very much, and we solve things in very different ways. And so even though I really don't have a deep understanding of the Austrian culture, I also don't think I represent what you probably have been reading about in the newspaper either. On the other hand, I think that, and I'm going to skip quickly over this because we need to make up some time. I think that the organizational cultures that we see in schools are often more similar across countries than many of the larger cultures for a variety of reasons that I'll talk about. And culture, in my research, ends up being one of the most important features that determines whether or not a school is very successful once you've gotten beyond the competence of the teachers and the quality of the instruction in the classroom. That, of course, is the most important. And there are some basic assumptions, I think, that are heavily research-based. The first thing is that we know that organizational culture, it affects how people work together. It affects how they feel about their work and environment. It affects their motivation, and it affects how both adults and children learn. A second feature of culture that's particularly important is that they're very, very deeply embedded in education. Education is a conserving force in society, and it must be so because parents don't really want you to experiment on their children. So we need to always be in the process of balancing conservation and traditions. So culture is deeply embedded, but it can change. And leaders, school leaders and teacher leaders shape culture, but they can't do that on their own. No one person can change an organizational culture. Not even a small team can change an organizational culture. And that, in fact, is, I think, contradicts a lot of what I call the airport management literature, which assumes that you can turn around an organization in a very short period of time, largely by getting rid of everybody who used to work there and hiring new people who share your values. We don't do that in education, so it's really not possible. I want to make a couple of other comments. Organizational culture, there's a long history in organizational research about the difference between culture and climate, and I am not going to go into that because I would be here for an hour and you'd be very bored. But I like this quote, even though it's from a business website, and I'm not going to read it to you because you can all read. But I think the important point that I want to again emphasize is that organizational cultures are very hard to change, but having a strong culture is fundamental to the resilience of the organization, its ability to cope with the kind of pressures that every school and every institution of higher education in every country that I've been in is facing right now. So let's think a little bit about how this might be different from the way in which other people look at us, because we're a very special group. We live and we work in schools, or we research schools and higher education. We understand how it works. How do other people think about us? Well, these are the movies that many people are familiar with. Some from Europe, some from the United States, and they have a particular image in common, and I hear this all the time when I talk to people who don't know much about schools. This is how schools change. You've got a hero, you've got a bunch of disconnected teachers or faculty members, and the hero will ride in on a white horse if they're in the United States. I don't know how they enter in Austria, and they will fix things. This is another way of seeing culture. This is the Austrian educational system as it's described by Dr. Schmidt. You can see that this is a system that is deeply structural, and the structure is designed to make sure that nobody changes too fast, because everybody has at least 2 people to report to. So that's a different picture than the movies present, and one that probably a lot of people outside education don't understand. There's a third picture that I like, which is from a British researcher named Madeline Church, and it says that organizational cultures, particularly in education, they're like, I guess there's a German word for it that I don't know, which is they're felted together by their common tasks and experiences. So if you look at this picture, this doesn't work very well. These are the people or the organizations, and these are tasks or problems that they have to work on together, experiences that they share. And all of this forms a deeply entangled set of relationships that in fact determines how we make our next journey. Who have we been connected to in the past? What have we worked on together? Those are the things that matter most. So why don't we rely, as we would in the United States, on heroes? We love heroes. We have a romance of leadership that is very profound, just as Austria has somewhat a distrust of leadership because of our very different histories, I think. Why not rely on structures? There are a couple of reasons. School improvement, whether it's higher education or in primary and secondary or early childhood, it's what we call a wicked problem. That means it will never go away. There is no solution. You find a solution to one part of the problem and a new problem arises. We like to say that education is a bottomless pit of problems, particularly when it comes to thinking about the success of students. Just when we think we've found one way of looking at it and improving things, we see something else that comes up. So it's a wicked problem. Second thing is we know that there are no quick fixes. My colleague Joe Murphy, who is at the University of Vanderbilt, has done a study looking at quick fixes in business and in education and in public agencies, and has found that where they work, which they typically don't, they are based on teamwork and collaboration and not structural reorganization and leadership. But we're still learning about how different leaders in education affect the core business. How can they change what really matters in schools, which is instruction, or what students are learning, in how the curriculum is delivered, and how to capitalize on the resources that we have. We tend to do things this year pretty much the way we did them last year. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the ways in which I've been looking at culture and my colleagues, and so that we can begin to move on here. Edgar Schein is probably the most well-regarded. He articulates the issue of organizational culture as it's applied both to public sector organizations and private sector organizations, and identifies 3 different levels that we need to look at if we're going to do research on culture. Some of them you can see. If I walk into a school in the United States, I can tell by what student art is on the wall, what's the sign inside the principal's office, whether the doors are open or closed to the classrooms. I can tell you something about that school when I've been there for only 5 minutes, because I've been in lots of schools. A second level is this espoused beliefs and values. Those are the things that people can tell you. They may not be in a sign on the wall, but if you go up and stand next to somebody and tell me something that's really interesting that's happened in this school for the last year, you'll get the same story over and over again. So you know something about the school they can tell you. That third level, the underlying assumptions and beliefs are unconscious. People can't tell you about them. You actually have to spend a long time in a school in order to understand what is going on. So let me now talk a little bit about organizational culture in general, and I'm going to make a couple of assertions about why a strong culture is important that's based on research, both that I've done, that people have done in the private sector, and also in other public sector organizations. First of all, the interest in organizational culture is very recent. It's now so popular that we assume that it's been around forever. But when I have done a study of what kinds of work was being published, you don't see much of it until the 1980s. And even then, the early pieces that were published, they tended to look at culture as a drag. Culture is what keeps us from moving forward. Never we can look at our culture as a way of improving. So the early studies tended to link cultural change with, and this is primarily work in human resource development, organization development. It tended to link it to job redesign. So if we could change what teachers do and how they think about their work, or what professors do and how much they have to work in their job definitions, then we can change the culture. But by the 1990s, there was a huge surge of interest in education, both in research on universities and on schools. And what has that resulted in? What do we know? Organizations with strong cultures are more adaptable. They are better able to manage the kinds of pressures that we all face, because the world is changing very fast. So if you want to go into a school or a university that has done a good job, for example, of integrating new technologies into teaching, you'll find that they have a stronger culture than the schools or universities where it's scattered and only a few people are doing it. Organizations with strong cultures have much higher work and member commitment. And just as a personal level, when I went to the University of Minnesota, I had been at another institution of higher education, which I probably shouldn't name it, which had a rather fragmented culture. And people worked very hard, but they worked very hard on their own work. They were all, as we like to describe them, individual entrepreneurs connected with a concern for the parking. So when I went to the University of Minnesota, which has a very strong culture, even though it's a very large institution, it has a very strong tradition that binds people across departments. People were working very hard on making the institution a better place, not just making sure their own research went well or their own classes went well. That's true in schools as well. Organizations with strong cultures are better able to manage conflict. Now, conflict is something, of course, that you can paper over for long periods of time, but typically if you have a weak culture and there's a lot of conflict, people leave. If you have a strong culture, they say, why are we fighting? What is it about? Can't we talk about it? Can't we figure out why this is happening? And fewer people leave. And turnover is never good for organizations. Organizations with strong cultures have a higher capacity for innovation. That's been affirmed probably in more studies than almost any of the other findings that I'm presenting here. And they demonstrate higher performance. I would like to say the business sector likes to think that they're concerned in their research with the bottom line. But the best studies that link organizational culture to performance have been done in education and the public sector, not in the business sector, where they tend not to have as good measures of outcome. The power of culture is then I'm just to summarize, that when it's deeply rooted, and I'm not going to read this, when it's deeply rooted, it helps to create an internal cohesiveness that helps the organization to adapt to external issues. This is particularly important for schools these days, particularly important for schools. So let's talk about educational culture, and I have to say this is across many countries that I've been in. Look at the top part of this figure. What we would say is, this is my research, Michael Huberman, most of whose research was done in Switzerland. He described research as recipes for busy kitchens. That's what innovation is like in schools. We are so busy all the time. There are so many things going on. When the principal gets there in the morning, they have to get there an hour early, because if they get there when the teachers start to arrive, there are so many problems they can't actually get any work done. For teachers, there's always something that comes up in the classroom. So they're so busy doing things to get through the day and make sure it works all right that they have very little time to reflect. So that's one aspect of culture that we see in most school systems. I would say that it's been pointed out that in Japan that's less so, but we have not been in the United States very successful in importing all of the lessons of Japanese schools to change things, because we're so used to being busy, we actually don't know how to reflect very well. Educators' work is lonely, and that's true, again, in most school systems. Dan Lorty, who's a famous American sociologist, and did his first study of teachers' work and described schools as egg cartons. You see, the eggs are protected, they won't break each other, but they don't have much contact either. He went back in 2002 and said not much has changed. We've had a lot of rhetoric about change in education, but it is still, for most teachers in most schools, not much has changed. That's certainly true in the European countries that I am most familiar with. Schools and many universities have a lot of subcultures. It's particularly true in secondary schools, where teachers are divided not only by forms, but also by subject matters. But it's even true in primary schools. In fact, in primary schools, the worst case that I saw was where the teachers of the upper primary grades referred to the teachers of the lower primary grades as the primates. That's not a good culture. So they all have stories that reinforce their subcultures. Not all their stories are aligned, and the more large and complex the school, the worse it is. And we need to think about creating a strong culture by aligning stories. And this is a figure from Peter Senge, who, of course, works on organizational learning, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work, so that's a credit to him. This is another characteristic of education in most of the countries I've been in. Austria is a landlocked country, so you probably don't go crabbing very often. But if you do go to a seashore and look for crabs, you put them in a bucket without a top. Because if a crab starts to crawl out, the crabs in the bucket will pull him back in. So you don't need a top. Things are kept moving by the people who are already in the bucket, even if they prefer to be burrowing down in the sand. So my colleague Daniel Duke referred to this as very typical of education, where you don't really want to stand out in front of your colleagues. You don't want somebody to come and say, go and look at this excellent fifth form math teacher, because if you are like her, you too will be a good math teacher. They don't want you to say that. They don't want to stand out like that. It's not part of the way we do education. So we're even quite quiet in my university about the prizes that we give to our colleagues, the teaching awards, the awards for research. They're in very small letters buried in a newsletter somewhere. The other thing about schools is that because we have a very long, we have a child and we take them in preschool when they're very young and they leave at the end of the 12th year. Somebody who teaches in the 4th form doesn't even have a chance to think about where they're going. So what happens as a consequence? Many teachers emphasize, what am I doing this year in my school? Because they don't know where that student is going to go. And sometimes did the students come back and say, oh, Mrs. So-and-so, you were so important to me when I was in 2nd grade. So they don't really have a good sense of what will happen. So there's something missing in the big picture because we tend not to follow our students that way. We don't think about them that way. We think about right now. And they're also very cautious. We know why, there are good reasons for that, but the culture outside is changing, and students who come into universities today, they learn so differently than the students that I taught when I first started teaching, that if I taught in the same way that I did when I taught in 1975, when I had my first faculty position, I would get such poor teacher ratings that nobody would take my classes. So I've actually had to go back and observe primary schools in order to learn how to teach well because they're way in advance, I think, of much university instruction. But we know that we have to change, and yet there are very few resources in schools for making these kinds of changes. So we have, and I think this is true both in universities and higher education, and I love this picture, and I showed it yesterday, so I'll apologize for those who've been here. This is a bus in the Netherlands, where it doesn't freeze very often, but where it does, things get really stuck. In Minnesota, we know how to deal with snow. This bus is going nowhere. It is, you're gonna have to wait for some warm weather to unfreeze it. In the United States, of course, we use the image of the school bus very frequently because most of our children go to school on a school bus. It's part of our tradition. You don't have it. They go to school in a tram here. Or walk. But the culture of schools in many schools is a frozen culture. And a long time ago in the 1980s, Susan Rosenholtz referred to it as stuck schools and moving schools. This is a stuck school. What does it take to unfreeze? So we have to think about what's really, really important in the culture of schooling. Not these things that hold us back, but what could keep us moving. And the first thing is that we know who's supposed to be on this bus. We know that it's parents. We know that it's teachers. We know that it's the school leader. We know that it's the students. We know who's supposed to be there. And we also know they're with us for the long haul. You can't fire all the teachers and start over again the way they do in some industrial settings. We know that what our core business is. We know that student learning, student development is at the core, and everybody agrees on that. So there's some strong consensus about why are we here. That's important. Now, we also, for most teachers, even cynical teachers, if you scratch them, they will say, I went into education because I really wanted to help children become what they're supposed to be. I wanted to help them on their life development progress. That goes away in very weak cultures, but it's always there, I think, to be revived. And finally, we have to think about trust, which is the commitment of parents and professionals to changing the tires, getting things moving while you're still, like, we can't afford to send the children home for a year while we redesign the school. We have to do it while we're actually doing the work. So we have these busy places. This is really important to remember because it's fundamental to the design. So what matters if we want to change them? And here we're getting to the core of some of the research that I've been doing over a period of time. And I'm going to focus primarily on how adults work together, but I'm going to quickly go through the other two. I spent more time on them yesterday. What we know is that it's very important. Schools operate in bureaucracies. We can't help that. It's there in every country. We all have a bureaucratic mechanism, but the schools that do the best job are schools that have a cooperative culture, and these are the characteristics of how we go about solving problems when we see one. And this is just to say, if we see a problem, how do we go about solving it? If it's cooperative, we can walk away from it and say, oh, it's the school leader's problem. Or we can say, no, we have a cooperative culture. All of us need to be involved, including students and parents. If they're part of that culture, it becomes a much stronger, much more likely that it will move forward. It also needs to be adaptive. It has to be monitoring the environment. It has to be anticipating the challenges that will come, not waiting for that awful law to pass through Parliament, but thinking about what is behind that law. What do I need to be thinking about? To think about how we help people when there are opportunities and threats to become adaptive. We have to have policies and practices in place. You have to have a culture in which taking small risks is encouraged and therefore failure is tolerated. If failure is punished over and over again, whether it's the way we punish students or the way we punish teachers, you will not have a lot of change. And we have to actively engage the communities that matter, and that's typically parents. And that's a challenge for schools in most countries. Parents' engagement, community engagement tends to be weak in most settings. I'm going to just go through this. This is, you mostly work with, most of you work with schools, and you know that there's a very strong research base that suggests that academic press, that is a focus on learning and learning outcomes and thinking about what students are learning, is critical. But it is not associated with good outcomes unless there is an equal emphasis on student support. Similarly, when we have schools with a lot of very poor students or a lot of immigrant students, we see schools where they're all about caring, adapting, making up for the disadvantages that students bring in, and not enough academic press. Those are also schools that tend to be failing schools. So you need to have a balance between these two, and I'm not going to go into that in great detail. This is where I've spent a great deal of my time over the last decade, thinking about how adults work together in schools to create a climate as well as a culture for change. There are three elements to this. Professional learning communities have entered the language of Austria, as they have in most European countries. But I like to think about it in my research as actually being composed of three separate and quite distinct things that have to go on in a school. Professional community, and I'm sorry that does seem to be hard to read. Professional community isn't a structure, it's not a meeting place, it's what it is when you go into a school and you can watch people having thoughtful discussions. You can see them if you follow teachers around. You can see that they're working on things together. Collaboration means that they have joint projects that they work on together that might have a meaningful outcome for students. They share and talk about norms and values, so they're explicit about this assumed underlying aspect of culture, and that's particularly often when something where they disagree comes up, rather than saying, oh, of course we disagree, it's all right, we'll still go on. They confront it, and they focus on student learning rather than their own instruction. They keep the eye on what students are learning rather than on improving and refining their own techniques in their classroom. Now, in the United States, that's very hard because all the emphasis is on improving instruction. So moving people away from that creates a big difference. We see in schools that have these characteristics, we see that there's a lot of sense of efficacy among teachers. We know that sense of efficacy is very strongly associated with student learning. We see that there's a stronger sense of collective responsibility for student learning, which both in my research and other people's is very strongly associated with student outcomes. That is, it's not just my students this year, but our students over the whole time that we have them in this school. And you also can go into classrooms and see better instruction. I am not, and I never have been, a primary school teacher, but I have been trained to be able to go into a classroom and say, yes, the instruction here is better than in that classroom, and I will agree with experienced teachers who go in. You can see it. You can see it, and that instruction is associated with student learning. So we see that schools with higher levels of professional community have stronger instruction. We know that when teachers experience this, they have stronger classroom practice and they're much happier in their work. They are more motivated, and they also, teachers say things like, I would never go to another school. I will die in this school. I love it so much here. Schools with higher levels of professional community also create teams and adapt more rapidly. They found teachers engaged in problem solving. They don't just turn it over to the school leader. And they have a stronger sense of collective responsibility and curriculum leadership among teachers. So we see this in the United States, and this work has been replicated in a large scale in at least one European country, in the Netherlands, where they found had similar findings. And I can assure you the culture, the overall culture of the Netherlands and the United States are dramatically different. So you can see it and you can hear it. It is culture. The second part is organizational learning, and I'm going to go very fast here because I have been asked to speed up. Organizational learning in schools has three components that are particularly important. One is the memories that people share. If you have a strong culture, there are always stories. We used to do it this way. Remember, this was what happened the year the library burned and how we coped with that for a year. Or when a student died, this is what we did. It brought us together, or it tore us apart. You go into a school with an anthropological eye on, and you hear the same stories over and over and over again in any school. So it's the memory, and they're memories that they exude failure. We can't do anything right in the school. No matter what we try, it never seems to work. You can go into other schools that say, we can always figure it out. You know, it might take us a little while, but we're really good at this. And so you can hear that. That memory is really critical. You have to have a knowledge base. It's not just my research. Of course, I'm happy to go into a school and find out that somebody there has read something that I've written, but it has to be also the knowledge that they produce themselves, which may be talking about some research ideas, but it may also be collecting data that they need. It may be saying, you know, our students aren't doing as well in this particular area of algebra as we thought. Maybe we ought to look across our classrooms and see what's going on, what we could do better. So they develop their own, not research, but they have their own knowledge base. So it comes from the outside, it comes from the inside. And they also have to have processes for learning. They have to know what to do if they get new information. New information can be very odd, but I think when we first started having our first Muslim students in schools, it was a really surprise. It was new information, it was new data. People came in with headscarves. Most schools in the United States do not permit students to wear anything on their head in school. So you had to say, how are we going to work on this? What kind of a problem is this? Is this a problem of religious freedom? Is this a problem? So teachers who work together, excuse me, to think about that are far better prepared when they get their second, third, or fourth Muslim student in that school. So, I mean, that's just an example from an adaptation that we're seeing all over the United States right now, of course. So they have to have ways of handling it. The second thing that's important in culture and schools is trust. Absolutely critical, and it's been important. There's an organic trust. In Austria, 30 years ago or so, 25, 30 years ago, you could say this is a country with a deep shared history and culture. You share a common religion, you have a common history, not too much migration at that point. It was just beginning. People understood. You could make assumptions when you met people in the street about what they knew and understood and how they would act and how they would treat you. That's one kind of trust. That's important in schools, but not as important. There's a social contract trust. It's very widely between countries. If I go into a supermarket in the United States, I don't count my change because I assume they're going to give me the correct change. You wouldn't do that in some countries. So you have to know what the social contract is. If I counted my change in the United States, people would think I was very rude. They don't make mistakes. And then the important part for schools is relational trust. The other two are foundational. You have to know them, what they are. But relational trust is the trust that occurs because I know something about you. I have worked with you for a while. You can't have that in a school with high turnover of teachers or high turnover of principals or even very high turnover of schools. You never get that, of students, you never get that. So you have to work really hard at it in some schools. In other schools, it becomes quite easy. Now, as a country, I found this just before I came. Austria sits there. If you think about diversity and trust, everybody says, oh, there's so much migration, things, and trust is eroding. Well, Austria is very high in diversity within the European Union. But it's in the middle of the pack in terms of trust. And why might that be? Cross-national studies suggest that diversity is not erode trust. It actually can increase trust if you confront it in the right way. So cross-national studies look like this. Trust is not going to erode because you have immigration or different kinds of people moving in, and I think this is a challenge because we often look at it. It's a hard thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the forms of trust are going to erode. I want to talk a little bit now quickly. I have 5 minutes to talk about my most recent study, which is in process. So if you ask me for the paper, I can't give it to you. We've been looking at, and I have, by the way, I do have a lot more data. I can send you more of the underlying research things. But we looked at whether or not you can measure these aspects of culture that I've been talking about and see whether they're associated with student learning. And this is a very large study. It's a 5-year study, and I did it with a whole bunch of other people. So I can't credit everybody there, but there are a lot of other people. And we ended up looking at and having pretty good measures in our surveys of over 4,000 teachers and several thousand principals who are working in the same schools about these issues that I've talked to you about. And what we did was we compared the schools that were low performing on whatever tests their state used, which are different in every state in the United States, to mid-performing schools. And then we also compared them to high-performing schools. And it looks as if, from this study, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but no matter which aspect of these things that I've talked about, and negativity and conflict is our best measure of problem solving, that there is a significant and pretty strong effect size that says that every single one of these aspects of culture is important in predicting student learning. When we look at them collectively, how they work together, schools with stronger cultures in a pretty large sample of schools are far higher in their performance. So we have some evidence that at least on those tests, there are, those things are critical. According to mine, I have 4 more minutes. Now, I'm also very interested in the question of leadership. How can school leaders affect this? How can the district or the level of management just above the school, how can they help to produce these kinds of good cultures? So that was part of this larger study, but it's also other studies as well. So we looked at school leaders, the principal, and we looked at how teachers describe their instructional management and leadership. How teachers describe their trust of their school leader. And how teachers describe the degree to which they're engaged in helping to solve problems in the schools. Aspects of research on leadership that are very popular in the United States. And we found here that, that all 3 of those are related to teachers' reports of professional community. So when teachers are engaged in working with each other in respectful and deep ways around the improvement of their own work, they also report that they have strong leaders behind them that share, that provide them and ask good questions about instruction, and who they trust to treat them fairly and justly. And we also see then that student learning and their instruction is stronger. So this is the results from a structural equation model. I don't have the numbers there, but I can provide them. So we see that professional community, I'm leaning toward a revised view and saying that professional community is a shared responsibility. It's not just teachers, but it's teachers and school leaders working together, even though they have distinct work. So to summarize this, we'd say that administrators and teachers have a reciprocal relationship. They're dependent on each other. When principals encourage teachers to step forward and have a voice, teachers are more likely to trust the principal. When principals talk about instruction, visit the classrooms, make instruction a visible priority, teachers are more likely to trust their principal. When principals behave in these ways, teachers are more likely to develop a professional culture that focuses on assuming responsibility for making the school a better place for students. And they're more likely to engage parents too, which is kind of an interesting outcome. But the local authorities matter here, and I don't know whether I have the absolutely correct names of the local authorities. In the United States it would be a district, in Sweden it would be the commune. And we also asked principals, school leaders, to tell us, what does your municipal authority, what do they provide for you? How much professional development? How much do they focus on instruction as opposed to regulations? How well do they communicate priorities? When principals said their districts are doing that, their teachers said, I have a strong instructional leader. So we didn't ask teachers about the district. They don't have any contact with it. We asked them about their own school leader. So you can see that there's a ripple effect of what districts do affect principals. Principals then change their behavior and teachers see it. Local networks are also very critical. We were particularly interested in, principals are being held accountable more in many more countries. They also are more or less likely to be involved in networks, so we looked at that together. We found that networks were very important. If principals said, my district brings us together and has us solve collectively problems that occur across our schools, in our municipality, the teachers report more professional community. They don't know that. They don't know what their principal's doing when he's out of the building. Teaching goes up, the quality of teaching, and student achievement goes up. Again, this is a structural equation model. So in other words, local authorities that support the cultures that contribute to, can support cultures that contribute to student learning by ensuring access to professional development over the life course for a principal, not just new principals, but experienced principals. So they need to strengthen these school level capacities. And they have to give unambiguous priority to the improvement of student outcomes and instruction. And finally, they need to emphasize professionalization at all levels and teamwork. That does not happen everywhere in the United States. I suspect that may also be true in Austria, but of course I wouldn't want to comment on that. I'm going to skip over this because I just want to sum up. Culture is viewed by policymakers as a soft improvement. You can't see it, you can't easily test it, so they tend to go for the easy, what I consider, a revision in curriculum, a change in mature, or a student test, a change in the structure of schooling. They go for what you can see, a new building. But the soft culture affects how people work together, adults work together, and it has a strong impact on instructional effectiveness, and from what we know, a much stronger effect than changing the structures, the policies, or the formal organization. So what's our implication for leadership in Austria? Let's get back to the nots. We have municipal actors or owners who are very varied. We have university partners increasingly. We have teacher groups, both the Teachers Association, but also within a municipality. I am assuming there's some. We have individual teachers are part of this. They have to change. We have students, we have school leaders, then we have resource decisions. Where are they made? How are they made? Assessments, professional development. This is a mess. This is a mess. So vision and planning and structural change aren't enough. You have to address culture by supporting individuals and groups to preserve what they value most, guiding a school at chipping away at those aspects of the culture that get in our way, unfreezing the bus, bringing out some warm weather, helping members to understand the forces and conditions that will shape the future, that will help them to adapt culturally, and consistently checking to see that the aspirations for change are understood, felt, and result in observable changes in behaviors in school. And that's all I have to say today.